3D CGI is generally seen as a touchy subject in the anime community, mainly because, unlike with, say, Hollywood, you can often tell when these elements are being incorporated, thus damaging your sense of immersion and believability. Most of the time it's either in the background, or it's a 3D element interacting with an entirely 2D world, and naturally both can be easily spotted when done poorly. But CG in and of itself is not without merit, and we've started to see entire shows produced in this way that are able to take advantage of what this different style has to offer. And then there's Berserk 2016. Don't worry, I'm not gonna beat that now zombie horse at this point. Instead, I want to take a look at two different, good shows that are almost entirely CG and how one uses that to its fullest potential, while the other honestly hampers the overall enjoyment. Let's do this. Now, I am aware that several videos have already been made that have explored this idea, but I think a direct comparison between two competent CGI series will bring to light what techniques are used and how they can make it feel like a story should be told in 3D rather than 2, but also vice versa. Because that tends to be a common criticism with series like these, that they'd work just fine with traditional animation, and there isn't enough to justify adding that additional axis. Disney! Sorry, I'm actually coughing. Getting over a cold. Anyway, that's an entirely separate video. But the idea is still very much the same, with the goal seeming to only be emulating the 2D aesthetic. This is by and large where my, as well as I think most people's problems with the recent Netflix series The Dragon Prince stem from. The story is good, the characters are lovable, and it has the same palpable sense of charm that the creator's previous series, Avatar: The Last Airbender, had. But I'm gonna be completely honest, when I saw the trailer, my enthusiasm dipped a bit when I saw it was gonna be 3D CG. And it fell even further when I saw how they had seemingly scaled back the frames to 12 per second to try and replicate the feel of traditional 2D animation, with the resulting motion feeling incredibly stilted and several moments showcased front and center in the trailer just looking bad. Now that being said, you do notice it less as it goes on, but it's something that really shouldn't have been an issue in the first place. And the more I watched, the more I found myself asking if it needed to be made like this. Because along with the replication of a two-dimensional art style comes some pretty conventional shot composition, only occasionally making use of the freedoms 3D allows for. What's more is I noticed they even tried to copy how traditional 2D background characters are done. Take this training scene in the first episode, for example. Some of the background characters are completely static, whereas others move like a frame every 4 seconds as if they're playing the world's slowest game of charades. This isn't at all uncommon in 2D, and like with the case here, the action is meant to pull your attention front and center, but when it's done in 3D, it just feels lazy. After all, that's the reason why so many crowd shots nowadays are done with CGI, because it's just so much easier to animate in a simple walk cycle. Granted, people don't like this approach, but when your characters are already fully CG, there's much less of an aesthetic break. And here it feels like that's happening too, just in reverse. Because there's no reason to not have them move unless you're deliberately trying to present it in a 2D style. Which, again, I just have to ask why? Why tell a story using this different technique, but then only occasionally use the tricks that make said technique unique? There are more things I want to say, and will, but in order to fully explore them, it makes more sense to first switch gears and talk about the best example of an almost entirely CG series, Land of the Lustrous, aka Houseki no Kuni. Where shows like, say, Kato the Right Answer and The Dragon Prince fail, it succeeds. And unlike with most series, we actually have the ability to get a glimpse of what it might have looked like animated in 2D, thanks to this video from a few years back promoting the first volume of the manga. As you can see, it's still very striking, and the animators clearly did their best to make the gem qualities of the characters shine. Pun completely intended. But still, I think a lot of people would agree that the series proper does a better job just by the nature of 3D as a visual medium. According to an article from Sakuga Blog, the staff spent months tweaking how the light should refract through and reflect off the hair of the gems. And that really shows, as it looks soft enough to brush your hand through, while still having a solidity that reminds you it's pure stone. It's incredible, but you might be thinking that it's unfair to use Houseki no Kuni as a comparison because of this. Part of the reason why it looks so great is because the gems seem like they were just meant for 3D, right? And I would agree with you, except the series doesn't just leave it at this. Had that been all they added with an extra dimension, then it wouldn't really be too different from something like Kato or The Dragon Prince, where there was the occasional prop or set piece that really did benefit from the 3D style, but not enough to justify an almost entirely CG series. Because there are other ways to make something look as unique or striking. Just that element itself can be 3D. For example, Hisone to Masotan managed to make CG jets blend in perfectly with an otherwise 2D world. But back to Houseki no Kuni. It's very clear the people in charge of this production wanted to use the 3D format to its fullest. There's the aforementioned designs, but it also shows in the direction. This is of course most apparent in the action scenes where the camera is able to precisely follow the characters if needed and can change angles on a dime. But there are also just as many times where the camera changes depth and rotates in much softer and subtle ways, always adding something to the scene they're used in. To provide an example of each that are conveniently close together, I draw your attention to episode 6. After it looks like the Amethyst twins are about to be taken, we see this shot of Bort rushing in to save them. There's this incredible long take where the camera is seemingly racing along with Bort toward the Lunarians, only to briefly slow down as we cross Phos's path. Almost as if they have their own gravity that's tugging at the cinematography and likewise reminding us that they are powerless in this moment. The momentum then gets yanked back by Bort entering the frame and carries through to their first hit. The camera then continues to follow subsequent sword strikes until the twins are rescued. As we head into the falling action, literally, the camera locks onto Phos as her attention is entirely on Sensei. Unable to move, they need to be physically dragged off, and as that happens, our view rotates to keep them in frame, showing how absorbed Phos is and at the same time reiterating that prior sense of paralysis, thus adding more weight to that moment from earlier. I just love how much is conveyed here through camera work alone. The command over and even simply awareness of this aspect is something that the Dragon Prince only occasionally has. There are simple pans and the occasional zoom, but those things are used in 2D all the time. Where it showed the most was in the action scenes, though even then it didn't feel like the camera was being used as dynamically as it could be. There's an action shot in the 3rd episode that especially highlights this. At first it does seem to indicate the greatest sense of how a camera can be used in this type of environment. But then, right as we're about to get an interesting fight with probably the most active camera work of the series so far, it cuts away. Yup, the action is put on hold, and when we return to it, there just isn't that same flair. If anything, more use is made of the CG character models than the camera. And going forward, the series isn't incredibly action-heavy, so the shot composition remains largely flat. It just feels like there was almost never any creativity or experimentation with this format outside of maybe a handful of moments where it was deliberately planned. And even then, those shots that are largely action-focused merely follow the action, direct your eyes, so to speak. And that's fine, but when that's all those shots do, I don't think you're fully grasping how the cinematography can be used. Just contrast any of these shots with my previously cited example. There's no additional meaning or significance to speak of. What's more is that there didn't seem to be an awareness of the disadvantages that come with this style. This isn't harping again on the frame rate specifically, but scaling it back as much as was done makes it harder to incorporate things like 2D elements that wouldn't then come across as choppy. This is likewise intertwined with the fact that 3D models don't really have varying degrees of quality. And in productions scaled for a TV budget, your characters are only going to be so detailed. The same goes for objects. And because of that, if an item or expression is meant to carry more significance than normal, it's hard to show that in just 3D. You can't simply draw it with more detail, instead you need to design a new, more defined model for the 1 or 2 close-up shots you might have. Now, it's not as if that's the only way you can choose to convey significance. With a 3D environment also comes the ability to control the lighting to an easier degree, symbolically and literally highlighting moments as important. But the Dragon Prince is again incredibly scant on all of these tricks. If you go through now and watch the series, you might notice a few moments, but I struggle to think of any shots that really stood out due to these methods. It's possible that part of that is because a good chunk of the environmental settings seem hand-drawn, but Houseki no Kuni had those too and it didn't feel limiting then. Maybe it's because the Dragon Prince didn't really have any unique landmarks in its fantasy-scape setting? I don't know. But on the note of Houseki no Kuni, let's revisit it. There are actually a good number of shots that rely on traditional 2D. They're often in the blink and you might miss them category of shots, or ones that by the time you do start to think it might not be 3D, we're back to business as usual. It helps that many of them are used when there's only hands or legs as the focus of the shots, and their purpose is also tied to that. 2D isn't used for the hell of it or at random, but rather when they wanted to convey a more intimate and tangible sensation. My favorite example of this is probably in episode 2 when Bort hooks Phos with a sword through their tie. It's so fast with only a few frames, and the change from 3 to 2D being masked by a zoom, effectively selling you on the force of the blow. We then quickly cut back to 3D as Bort hoists Phos up like the tall glass of glass that they are. And it's not just shots like these, because there are often occasions where, if they want to get more emotion out of the CG models, they will animate expressions over them in 2D. It's subtle, but you can tell when they do so based off Fose's eyelashes. They'll have these extra frills and touches to them that, if you look at their base 3D design, aren't present. It goes back to what I said about detail. Yes, Fose and the other gems will naturally look less defined from further away, but close-ups with the normal models have their limits. And doing this trick with 2D is a great way to compensate for the normal aspects of animation like squash and stretch that aren't really possible in 3D. Certainly not to the same extent anyway. Going along with this, as I mentioned, lighting is another area in which the creators of Houseki no Kuni showed their prowess. Character introductions like with Daya and the Amethyst twins are simple but gorgeous as the colors change to reflect the specific gem. And the environmental lighting is just as stellar, every time of day or night feels unique, and the same goes for when it becomes winter. Also, shots like these really just speak for themselves. The point here is a production like Houseki no Kuni played to the strengths of both 2 and 3D, knowing when to use which. But with something like The Dragon Prince, the production only seemed passively aware of the final format it was being made for. The story, themes, and characters are still strong enough that you can enjoy the show, but it's unfortunate that the visuals end up being the thing that hinders it the most. Every medium is going to have its pros and cons, and even though anime is always a visual one, the shift in dimensions is enough to reconsider what can and should be done. So if you're making a story, think about the format you want, but also how that format can help you best express what you want to about that story. Because it's going to be different whether it's a book, song, painting, comic, or anime. The creators of Houseki no Kuni clearly considered this, whereas I can't really say the same for The Dragon Prince. But those are just my thoughts, and as always, I'm interested to hear what you have to say. What piece of media do you think works best in its medium? Is there an adaptation you think should have stayed a book, manga, or game? Whatever your thoughts are, let me know down below. Thanks as always for watching, and an especially big thanks goes out to my awesome patrons, PenguinPandaZero, OverjoyedSoup, MVPino, James Morton, Mr. Idealist, Marbled Ranger, Spudge, Beorn, dxprog, DMAYaichi, and everyone else whose support helps make videos like these possible. Links to that Patreon, my shirts, and everything else are either on the screen now or down below. Leave a like and click that bell icon to keep up to date. Stay awesome, and I'll see you next time.